Hello there. Welcome to General Welfare Presents. This is the 45-year veteran political agitator with Lyndon LaRouche. Anyhow, things are getting very tense. We are at the point where it could go to war or it could go the other way. And what I'm going to try to do in the first part of this is give you a sense of the situation. Okay. So the pinnacle of the situation is the trade negotiations between Donald Trump and China. Because whatever trade agreement comes out of this thing is could very well be the beginning of a new global economic system in the direction of Lyndon LaRouche's New Bretton Woods. And I'll explain. This bilateral agreement could very well bring the United States into the Belt and Road and give the United States a massive export market like it hasn't had, since it was an industrially exporting country. That requires a dramatic internal change in the activation of the workforce in manufacturing, especially, and in other areas. Right now, the U.S. economy is mainly financial services, and the dollars are issued, and these dollars, because they are the basis of the world financial system, can be used to buy goods from all over the world, and then those countries use those dollars to trade between themselves up to a certain point. There's been a lot of barter stuff starting to occur. But the point is that the United States, beyond exporting agricultural products and to some degree information products, IT products, the primary thing that the United States is exporting is financial services. And the problem with that is what Trump is trying to do is shift the whole thing back to a manufacturing, or towards a manufacturing orientation, to move the population out of the service economy into the productive area of the economy. And this can be done in collaboration with the Chinese. And also the Chinese could be involved in the internal infrastructural development that would have to go with this change in the United States. So the trade agreement between Donald Trump and the Chinese could be the stepping stone, or the first step towards a new financial architecture. And then you could bring in Russia and India, and between the four of them you could establish a new agreement among nations on how to conduct trade, how to basically a new fixed exchange system, a new agreement that has to emerge to replace the existing City of London dope dollar, petrodollar, crime dollar, financial speculative dollar system, which does not allow for countries in the European zone and the U.S. zone to invest in internally, because that's not what the system doesn't work that way. It's a financially plundering system, and the dollars are used internationally, are used for financial speculation and for financial services, but not for long-term development. And this whole issue is emerging in the discussions between Donald Trump and also between Donald Trump and Pelosi and Schumer around the question of infrastructure. And what they're proposing is a $2 trillion 10-year program, which frankly it should be about a $20 billion 2-year program. The Chinese say the U.S. needs 10 trillion. We're saying the U.S. needs 20 trillion and upgrade to high-speed rail and upgrade to the more advanced technology. So, but then again, there's no means to finance it, and Donald Trump correctly believes that the public-private partnership approach doesn't work, and in his words, the government just ends up being sued by the private sector. I mean, that's what it ends up being. And it's not a very good partnership. And essentially you're using the government to enrich the Wall Street, basically, and you're using at the excuse of saying you're building infrastructure. So this is at the center of it, of the issue. Now, how does that relate to the war situation? Well, in the following way. Iran is the most pivotal country in the entire global Belt and Road system in two ways. The first way is that it's the bridge through Pakistan and India into Turkey and Europe. It's also the bridge into the Middle East and into Africa. So that's the first way. The second thing this is very important, is that through the Straits of Hormuz flows somewhere between a quarter to a third of the world's oil, probably more like a quarter. And if you have some kind of military operation, then essentially that whole avenue of export of oil gets blocked. And we're not talking about Iranian oil, we're talking also Iraqi oil, we're talking UAE oil, we're talking Qatar oil, we're talking, a lot of Saudi Arabian oil. So now that oil is not anything the U.S. consumes. It's primarily the nations eastward of the Straits of Hormuz who are consuming it. We're talking India, Southeast Asia, Japan, and China. So a blockage of that would not only skyrocket the prices of oil, which would have an incredible effect on the world economy, but it would also do severe damage to the Belt and Road, because there's a lot of economic development, and part of that depends on oil, on energies. And if you jack up the price beyond belief, even if you cut it off, even if you don't cut it off, it's going to have a very. We are reminded of the 70s oil hoax and what that did to developing countries. It was devastating. You had all these countries starting to develop, and then the ones that weren't producing oil got hit with this oil hoax crisis, this oil crisis. The prices went through the roof, and they had to go into massive debt to avoid shutting down their countries, and then they ended up, over the barrel. So this is a very so those forces in the world led by the British Empire, which includes a good chunk of the Trump administration, if not the entirety of Congress, most of Congress, and definitely the State Department, absolutely the entirety of the State Department bureaucracy. This is coming to be the last chance to stop the Belt and Road. Now, a week and a half ago, the second conference on the Belt and Road occurred in Beijing, and at that conference, there were 37 heads of state, 1,600 cabinet officials, 5,000 business. It was huge. And what has emerged from that conference and the reality of the actual on-the-ground activity is that the Belt and Road is for real. It's not, everyone said it couldn't work. Everybody in the West said it couldn't work. All the top economists, all the pundits, all the prognosticators, all of them said it couldn't work because you're dealing with countries that are unstable, that don't have, they can't make deals, they can't deliver on the deals, there's terrorism, there's corruption, and you name it all, China is just doing this to get these countries under their control. They're not doing it to really have a successful infrastructure development. Well, they are having a successful infrastructure development because the Chinese model of working with these countries is not the Western model. It's very flexible. It's based on a memorandum of understanding, not on a treaty. A memorandum of understanding means we agree that this is what we're going to do. Now, that's it. There's no contract that says, there's no treaty that says that on this date you have to do this and this and this. It's not like that. The memorandum of understanding means that it's the go-ahead for the Chinese private sector and the private sector in the relative country to work together and make their own agreements and make their own deals, and the Chinese will then go ahead and invest, but it's flexible. If something goes wrong, they can change it, they can modify it. They don't have to be controlled by a global court or some kind of legal mechanism that kicks in when something goes wrong. And then now you're all, everybody's fighting everybody. You don't have that. It doesn't work that way. That's not the way the Chinese are doing it. But this trade deal with the U.S. is, it's really more profound because it's about what is this going to be? Is this going to be bringing China into the corrupt City of London, Wall Street, global speculative system so that China can be parasitized and the West is allowed to come in with their financial services and all of that to start to suck out of the Chinese economy, or is this going to be a different agreement where the U.S. comes into the Belt and Road as a partner and China gets to preserve its more or less its system? Now there are changes that China can make on a whole series of development, but they're not going to let Google and Facebook and come in and use the data from the China, have access to all the data of China the way they do here. The Chinese aren't going to let you do that. But that's one of the sticking points in the agreement, according to the Washington Post, if you can trust them. So all of this is coming to a head pretty soon. Trump is saying a deal has to be done soon, and whether that's so. But if you look at the Iran situation, that's part of the whole process. The question is this whole thing with Iran part of the pressure being put to force China to make concessions, or is this an attempt to wreck the Belt and Road in one of the only ways that it could be wrecked at this point, which is a war with Iran? That's about the only way, one of the only ways you could have a potential of causing an international economic crisis and which impacts the world and China as well. So that's where the two are linked, the trade agreement and the war with Iran, in terms of where this is going to go. And you have to understand that it's a very desperate situation for the British Empire, which is huge. The British Empire is still the most powerful entity in the world. It is more powerful than the United States. The United States is potentially more powerful, but it's not. It's very weakened by the corruption of the British Empire. And so this takes you into the situation with Barr, the Attorney General. I think it's William Barr. Anyhow, he's got a problem in that, to the degree to which he remains loyal to the truth or loyal to an honest investigation into what's going on, he's going to get the same treatment that Trump is. And now he's getting the same treatment that Trump has been getting. You know, and there's a huge hue and cry about his malfeasance or his thing. And he was set up by Mueller, but it wasn't Mueller who set him up. It was the staff of Mueller. Because he's in contact with Mueller directly, so it's the staff which wrote the letter, not Mueller. Mueller signed it, but the staff wrote the letter. And the question was, he was indicating that he was not aware of the objections that were coming from Mueller, but the objections weren't coming from Mueller, it was coming from the staff, which Mueller signed on. So this is the basis for contempt and all of this stuff. It's quite amazing how this is all playing out. But this is a full court press against the president and also now against the Attorney General, who used to be the Attorney General under Bush Sr. And for a while, Bob Mueller was under him as the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department. So you have to ask yourself, why is he coming under attack? Well, probably because he's probably not doing what he should be doing given his pedigree, which is working to get rid of Trump. And that's essentially what the op-ed by Comey says, is that Trump has taken away his soul. As bit by bit. You know, it's really nasty stuff. However, there's still the declassification of all these documents, and Trump is further indicating the role of the British. So this is very crucial, because you have to go after the British on this, because that's the empire. That's where the directions are coming from. That's where the congressmen are. This is where Obama's people are getting their instructions. This is where the worst element of Congress is getting. It's coming directly from the British. The British are orchestrating this whole thing through various different channels, and they're doing it. And until you go after them, you can't really shut this thing down. You can't really shut this whole coup which is going on. They're going to keep it going for as long. They'll keep it going. And if Trump wins the election, they'll keep it going after that. This is how crazy the situation is. Now, fortunately, the vast majority of people are not really going along with this. And there seems to be, from my own personal experiences out in the street and others I'm picking up, that there is this shift going on in the population towards Trump. Trump is sounding more reasonable than all these other presidential candidates. And one of them is the governor of our state. And this guy, he is either absolutely stupid, beyond redemption, beyond any kind of redemption, any kind of enlightenment. I shouldn't say redemption. Or corrupt beyond redemption. He's either corrupt beyond redemption or stupid beyond any kind of enlightenment. He is talking about eliminating natural gas and and coal as energy sources in Washington State. Of course, most of the energy, a large part of the energy comes from hydropower. But he also wants to get rid of some of the dams because he wants to save the salmon so Orca can eat. The guy is campaigning for president as the eco-fascist candidate. He is trying to stake out his that corner of the electorate, the eco-fascist electorate, and he's using what he has done in Washington State as his credentials to run a campaign for president based on his eco-fascism. And this is really something. And I can tell you that outside of Seattle, you know, you're dealing with a population that's being really screwed by all of these environmental restrictions and by all of these taxes and so forth. And these are, these are millions of people. They're not as many as in Seattle, but they are human beings, and they are not going to sit back and go along. So you're going to get a blowback to this thing, which is huge. And you'll see that in the next elections. And I think it's very significant. And so don't be surprised if you see in 2020 the kind of shift in the election that you saw in 1994 when the both houses went Republican, and a lot of Democratic areas went Republican and so forth. Not that I'm that fond of Republicans, but that's the kind of thing that he's setting up. He's setting up for a huge backlash, and this problem in Seattle of complete tolerance of drug trafficking on the street, which has allowed for this homeless, which is not homeless, they're actually drug addicts, that pay $10 a pop, and they live in tents, and they are becoming more and more of a problem. This is a rich city, and they can put $1 billion in to help this thing, which they probably have, but it hasn't worked because they're not arresting the drug dealers and not intervening to deal with the drug addiction and the criminal dealing. And this is all in a documentary called "Dying in Seattle," and this is so amazing because it's the liberal toleration of the destruction of human beings by allowing drug dealers to be basically free to do whatever they want, which is the foretaste of what kind of world we will live in if you decriminalize all these drugs, which is what's happening in Seattle. They've pretty much decriminalized heroin, crack, smack, heroin, methamphetamine, and so forth. And it's this mindset that is totally depraved, and it's the British Empire basically establishing dominion through addiction and through this kind of thing, which they've been doing for a long time, and they want to do more of it. And George Soros is doing everything possible to break down the drug laws, decrim every drug. Everybody should have the right to become a heroin addict, to become and if you want to know the face of the British Empire, look into the face of your loved one that's dying from methamphetamine. That's the real face of the British Empire here in Seattle. So this is what we're up against, but the turning point is coming because this trade deal with China is kind of the fulcrum of a new direction or not. And if it's not, it's going to be war. Because China isn't going to surrender, and Russia isn't going to surrender, and Iran isn't going to surrender. And so we're going to be at war. And then the consequence of the war, if you keep it below the nuclear level, they hope perhaps to wreck the Belt and Road, which is now the reality that's governing the world. The reality that's governing the world is increasingly the Belt and Road system. So that's where we are. And in this context, we have a crisis, an incredible cognitive crisis in the economists and the advisors and so forth in the U.S. The people advising Donald Trump, the people who have gone through the academic accreditation in economics in business schools, they may have a sense of microeconomics, but when it comes to how to rebuild a collapsing nation, when it comes to the kind of economics that China is now doing, which is based on LaRouche, they are hopeless. And the most important item right now to create the environment for everything that has to happen is the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. By the way that LaRouche was vilified, slandered, and treated back in the 80s and 90s. And Ramsey Clark has said that this was the worst case of abuse of government abuse against any group that he's at, that in the history of the United States, essentially, and that that has to be brought back and examined, because the ideas that Lyndon LaRouche has had, which have influenced the nations around the world, have to be available for people to study, for people to have access to at this time. Because you can't really resolve the China-U.S. crisis because you have two different systems. The system that LaRouche represents, which is coming into being, which is basically goes back to Hamilton and Leibniz, and the system that we have under the City of London and the secrecy jurisdictions and the whole global system. Those two systems don't work together. And there is no possible way for Trump to deliver on Make America Great Again without defeating the British Empire. And if Trump can enlist China as an ally, then he goes a long ways to defeating the British Empire, because that'll also bring Russia in as an ally. And between the three of them, they could probably defeat the British Empire. But each by themselves cannot do that. And it's the British Empire which needs to be defeated in order to save this nation from the depredations, from the destruction, from the cultural degeneration, the drug addiction, the despair, and all of that. Now, granted, Trump has started to move people out of that despair, many people out of that despair, but that he cannot move them, continue to move them indefinitely unless there are fundamental structural changes in the way the financial system works, along the lines of what Lyndon LaRouche has laid out. Glass-Steagall, the first law, the credit system, second law, massive emphasis on infrastructure with the credit system, and then going to fusion and the space program. And a lot of those components exist in the Trump administration: the space program, a return to nuclear, the whole thing with the climate panel that's going to come out with Hepper leading it, which is going to challenge the whole greenie genocide operation. All of this is coming into place, but at this very moment, the China-U.S. trade agreement is sort of the pivot of the whole thing.